Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Attendance Bias. I am your host, Brian Weinstein. This week's guest is a name that most fish podcast fans will recognize. It's RJB, the CEO and co-founder of Osiris Media. As a podcaster myself, I'm always looking up to the professionals in the industry, and especially in the fish podcast world. And you can't really get more professional than Osiris Media. A few months ago, I had Tom Marshall on Attendance Bias to talk about being the face of Osiris Media, also about the Undermine podcast, which was then wrapping up its first season, and Fish's performance of David Bowie from December 29th, 1994 in Providence. Tom was excited to talk about everything, but he was unable to give too many details about Undermine, Osiris's flagship podcast that tells about Fish's history and experience in a sort of non-linear way. Since Season 1 was just completed at the time, Tom didn't have too much to say yet about Season 2. But now Season 2 of Undermine is scheduled to air next week, on Wednesday. With it coming up, I was really excited to hear more about it, and RJ was more than happy to share what listeners can expect when Season 2 gets underway on September 8th. For today's episode of Attendance Bias, RJ picked 46 Days into Bug from August 15th, 2015 at Meriwether Post in Columbia, Maryland. Played right before the Magnaball Festival, RJ and I break down how the band was experimenting and discovering different musical avenues throughout the whole summer of 2015 and the influence of Fare Thee Well on that tour. We also talk about how all those musical explorations came to fruition at the end of this tour, especially during this Meriwether Post run, as it was the last stop on the road toward the ultimate summer culmination, Magnaball. So let's join RJB to hear about Season 2 of Undermine, the temporary return of the Helping Friendly podcast, and 46 Days into Bug at Meriwether Post from August 15th, 2015.
Let's meet today's guest.
RJ, welcome to Attendance Bias. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me on.
My absolute pleasure. I'm excited to talk about so many things today, including your background as a fish fan, including Undermine and Osiris Media, and of course, 46 Days into Bug from August 15th, 2015 at Meriwether Post, a show that I was at, and I always love talking about those shows and jams from 2015, but we'll get there. Before we do, we are recording this show right before Fish starts their 3-night stand at the Gorge. Before anything, how's your summer been? What shows have you seen so far?
It's been good. I went to Nashville for 2 shows and got to see my first shows back there. Amazing venue, great city. There's some other stuff going on down there, so that was a good week. And then I went to Friday and Sunday of Atlantic City. It's been great, man. You know, we've been doing these live recaps after every show, and we brought the Helping Friendly podcast back. So I've been doing a lot of talking about and thinking about fish. So it's been a lot of fun to get back to it for sure.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that, the Helping Friendly podcast, because I thought, well, my impression was that it was kind of absorbed by Undermine once that started, but it's come back. I was pleasantly surprised to see it, that you guys were going to do recaps basically after, if not every stop on the tour, then every few shows. Did you all decide that the Helping Friendly pod is almost like South Park now? Like, you don't have a regular series, but whenever it's appropriate, you kind of make a comeback and record episodes as you see fit?
Yeah. So what we weren't going to bring it back. So it did get folded into Undermine along with Beyond the Pond and Under the Scales. And we were approached by a sponsor, this cannabis company in Colorado, that said, you know, we want to bring this back and do a summer and fall kind of tour recap and integrate it with the brand. And so we said yes to that. And the team now is not just the HF pod team, it's the Undermine team that's kind of helping out with HF pod. So Brian and Dave and the 4 HF pod guys and Tom too. So it's sort of now like a sub, you know, it's like a smaller piece of Undermine or a more focused piece. But no plans to bring it back. We even talked about doing quick hits or coming back with tour recaps. And we were like, you know, at this point with our business where we are, it doesn't make sense to take on another show unless there's some sort of sponsorship or other incentive for us to kind of bring it back. So now we have that. So it's pretty cool.
I've listened to a bunch of them. It sounds like, this is going to sound funny, but it sounds like putting on an old college sweatshirt. It sounds like you just all slipped right back into it. The chemistry is immediately apparent. The cadence of each of your voices is right back. I used to listen to the Helping Friendly pod when I was at the gym, and it was just such a great way to not pay attention to what you're doing while, while eating up what you love. And that vibe is immediately apparent right there, just as I've gotten used to a lot of the different shows on Osiris.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thanks for being a fan. I hadn't hosted a podcast in 6 months or something, and getting back to it, it's fun. It's easy to dive back into it, especially with this topic, and like you said, the team, and it is like getting back into the groove. But I was 6 months went by for the first time in like almost 10 years where I wasn't doing a podcast as a host, but working on a bunch of them. So it's cool to be back, and we have a lot more to do with all these shows coming up.
Yeah, definitely. And I want to ask you about that with Osiris Media and having so much to do, because a few months ago, I spoke with Tom Marshall about Osiris and about podcasting. He gave a lot of background information of what it was like to transition from hosting Under the Scales to co-founding a whole media company. And to him, it was a huge leap. And you kind of made the other adjustment. You went from hosting a podcast to being a bit more behind the scenes. Would you be able to speak a bit about what the transition was like between positions of podcasting?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I just, in the podcast industry, I guess, which is still a very small and young industry. I had just been a host of a music podcast, and I figured out how to edit and kind of figured out how to market. And that's what I brought, but at the same time, I'd been running a company for 10 years, a communications company based in DC. So I had some experience with small business and managing people and all that. And I thought we were at the beginning of podcasting when we started in 2018, but it still kind of feels like the beginning. I mean, things are maturing, but it's changing a lot. It's changing all the time. So it feels like we're learning about a new industry as we're building a company. But I don't know, the transition wasn't super hard for me, mostly because like the communications company I worked for, what we did was we helped people tell stories. And that's, one of the main ingredients for what we're doing at Osiris, great people, great stories, building a brand. And
great music too.
Great music. Yeah. So, excuse me, I was able to kind of build on what I had learned before, but definitely I wasn't familiar with fundraising or promoting myself as the face of a company. Besides being sort of like the face of the Helping Friendly podcast, which was, a minor thing, but people would come up to me at shows and talk to me, and we did video stuff and all that. But yeah, I've learned a lot. I mean, it's the best job I've ever had, and wouldn't trade it for anything. It's a lot of fun, and we're growing, very quickly, which is, has a lot of pros and cons. Every day is a new challenge, and every day feels like a race to the finish. Startups are difficult and time consuming, and there's no real blueprint for what we're doing. We're just figuring it out as we go, and trying to stay innovative and focus on great stories and good people. So
and a little later, I want to ask you about that. I wanted to ask you in a bit when we get into Undermine, which I'm very excited to talk to you about the growing pains that you may have experienced as a business, because I've experienced my own, and I'm just one guy who has a microphone and a computer and some very gracious guests. I can't imagine having a whole media company with several shows under that banner. But let's talk about Undermine first, and we'll get to that behind the scenes stuff later. So the last episode of Undermine aired in April of 2021, and you've had some time now to reflect and get some distance from it. Looking back, how do you feel about how season 1 went?
So it's interesting because there's like the vision that we had, which is, I think season 2 is when our vision will kind of come to fruition. Season 1 was a little bit of like a combination of the 3 shows, kind of alternating episodes and trying to keep the thread throughout the season. Part of that is we didn't have the time to create what we're creating for season 2 for season 1. So it ended up being a little bit more of like an amalgamation of the 3 shows, whereas season 2 is it's going to feel like a totally integrated show. So, I mean, I'm glad we started with the 80s, like I think it's an era that people are familiar with, but also can use a lot more examination. So we were we were excited about it when we going into it, and we were nervous about what the audiences would say. We had three pretty good shows, but we knew we had like a bigger story to tell, and we could only do that with mostly the bigger team. As we're building this company, like my vision for Osiris is that we're going to be what we call ourselves as the leading music storyteller. And I think in that like mature version of the company, we'd be best served by having one awesome Phish podcast, having like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6. It's sort of like when we're going out to the record labels and to Spotify and Apple and talking to them about what we're doing, having Undermine as an anchor kind of show is it's a much more compelling argument than like we have 6 Phish podcasts and 5 Grateful Dead podcasts and a bunch of other stuff. So I don't know. I'm happy we did it, but we're trying to, establish it as the definitive Phish podcast in terms of storytelling, not the kind of stuff we're doing here, like commentary and discussing shows and discussing music is always going to happen. But in terms of like really laying the groundwork for storytelling, that's what we're trying to do.
Well, I'm glad you brought up that idea of storytelling, because that was definitely part of my thought about the shift from season 1 to season 2 of Undermine. And full disclosure, I haven't heard anything about season 2 other than the trailer that you've released. And it seems that the theme of season 2 is the idea of community and the different communities, or maybe the overall umbrella community that has developed around and with the band. The first season was kind of similar in that it was almost a patchwork that kind of added up to this big tale of Phish in the 80s. Was it difficult for you and the team to switch gears from storytelling mode into a more thematic aspect of Phish? Because community can mean anything to anybody when it comes to Phish.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's actually a bigger opportunity for storytelling because we're not bound by like the chronological, path. So we'll go through some history stuff and in specific episodes, but overall, the narrative thread is a little bit easier in season 2 because I think there is an overarching theme of essentially like the question that we're addressing is like why do thousands of people follow this band around the country, and that's like, to me, that's a slightly easier thing to build a story around than like what was the story of the 80s. It was like Phish trying to get to the point where they could really break out of Vermont, so to me it's actually like a bigger opportunity and slightly easier, but we learned some lessons from season 1 that we applied that I think are going to really make season 2 far better than season 1.
What's one of those lessons?
I mean, part of it is like when you're thinking about storytelling, do research, talk to as many people as you can, let the story kind of guide where the show goes, and don't be afraid to take it in directions that the interviewees tell you. So we talked to more than 100 people, which is pretty amazing. And Brian Brinkman, who's one of our executive producers and like manages this whole show, he did an amazing job organizing us and getting all these interviews set up, and he did a lot of the interviews, but we had 7 or 8 people, helping with interviews. So it was a big team. And we also added our friend Benji Eisen as our head writer. And he's a journalist. He knows how to tell a story, but he's also like a deep Phish person. So he's hilarious, and he and Tom have a good vibe. So Tom is the narrator with Benji writing a lot of that. In terms of like the storytelling through lines and the humor and the overall vibe, it's really, really fun. And I think as we grow, just in general, we're working with more and more journalists and writers on all the shows, or even just trailers we put together to pitch to people. It's like, if we're going to tell a story, we need professional storytellers. I was sort of like a pseudo professional storyteller at my previous job, so I can kind of like get us so far, but bringing people like Benji in just totally changes everything.
Well, that's why I'm on this side of the microphone. I want other people to tell the stories. I just want to ask about it.
Right.
I'll put the onus on the guest.
Exactly. I mean, I think in some ways asking good questions is harder, but I'm much better at asking questions than telling stories. So that's what's cool about building a team. Like we have, 10 people on this team helping to build Undermine, and everyone has their own expertise to add. So it's amazing how much smoother season 2 is just in terms of production than season 1 was.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. I was a big fan of season one. I was looking forward to it every day when the new episodes would drop, even when you announced that it would be switched to Wednesdays. And that's when I released my episodes. I was like, one more. Oh, I got to listen to another podcast now on my Wednesday. I got to double my commute. I hope I get stuck in traffic today. Like, I never thought I would say that.
Right.
And you just mentioned something about your process about finding interviewees and chasing down some things that they said and letting the story go where it will. I think a lot of longtime Fish fans of a certain age, I'll say, looking at myself in this little chat mirror and looking at you, I think that a lot of us feel, and maybe don't actually, but feel like we have a pretty solid idea of the band's history from reading whatever we could at the time before the internet and message boards were around, that we kind of solidified the band's history. This is what happened in 1987. This is what's important in 1989 and so on. Was there anything that you went into season two that you assumed you knew about the band that was completely debunked or maybe changed from your production of season two? Like some assumption you made that was flipped unexpectedly?
That's a good question. I mean, I think part of the difference between the first and second seasons is that season two is much more of like an emotional journey as opposed to like maybe an analytical journey of like, then they went here and played this show and then this happened. And, you know, we're taking a look at this community from a really like broad perspective. And I guess the thing that I learned, or that there wasn't anything that happened that I was like, you know, I didn't know this perspective from Jeff Holdsworth or something like from season one, but
right.
It kind of reinforces the fact that we see this community through our own personal experience and that of the friends and the people we know. Right. And when you step back and you talk to hundreds of people and you realize like, not just how multifaceted the community is, but also how many people's lives have been like so affected by this band, you know, emotionally, socially, economically. It's the scale of it is surprising. And I think
it's staggering.
Was eye-opening. There were stories from people that I didn't expect to hear, people who had illnesses and people who met their, you know, significant others on the tour, you know, just things that like really kind of reinforce the fact that this is such a strong community, and not just the people who go to the shows, right? It's the whole ecosystem that's grown around it. And in the first episode of season two, we start to take a look at how the internet evolved alongside of Fish. And that's just, you know, it's stuff that we all sort of know, but hearing people who were there in the early days talk about it is really fascinating. And so I think there's going to be like some deep dives and stories that make people either reinforce what they already thought, but through an entertaining story, or maybe even open their eyes to how much bigger this thing is than maybe we give it credit for.
You've said this already twice, maybe three times. It's funny to hear when you say, I think we all know this, or I think everybody knows that. The more shows I go to as I get older, I'm pretty surprised at how huge a fan base Fish has that is so much younger than I am. I'm 38 years old. So I know I'm probably right in the smack dab middle of the median of a general crowd that goes to a Fish show. I don't think I'm in the oldest level. I'm definitely not in the youngest level. But when I went to several shows during the Baker's Dozen, for example, every night I was here and there with people. It was their first show. Like, there's a lot of people who ask very basic questions on the fish.net message boards that I just took for granted that everyone knows it.
Yeah, we have a member of our team, Noah Eckstein, who's helped with writing for this season and the last one. And he's young and he's part of this kind of next generation of fans. And I think he's added a lot to our thinking, just in terms of what's the conventional wisdom and what people actually know and what we might take for granted as being, you know, the gospel of the Fish story. So yeah, I don't know. I'm excited for people to hear it because I think it's going to start some conversations and also give people, you know, older fans like us, reinforce a lot of and probably bring up a lot of memories, but also for younger fans, kind of tell this story that they might not have heard in full, you know?
Well, that's my favorite. I'm a middle school teacher, and that's one of my favorite parts of my job, when you get to tell a student, like, who in my case is 12 or 13 years old, something that I assume the rest of the world already knows, but to them, it's brand new.
Yeah.
I let everyone own it themselves, which I think relates back to the main theme of season 2, community, that you said everyone views it through their own lens. I think Fish has done an excellent job avoiding mainstream success so that the audience has ownership over it. Everyone has learned about Fish their own way.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah. And I think with technology and the way that proliferated in the rise of Fish, it's taken on forms that I don't think any of us could have ever imagined, from Facebook groups to all kinds of other crazy stuff. But it's really fun, and it'll be a different kind of journey for sure.
Even if you can't give details, did you and Tom and whoever else was in the room when you came up with Undermine, did you ever have a sense of scale of Undermine as a complete work? Like, do you have an idea of there's going to be this many seasons or this many topics? Or is it that you just keep digging until you've undermined everything that there is?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will say that we do know how many seasons we're going to do, and we do know what the final season will be. We definitely know what that final season looks like. What the seasons in between look like in terms of the order, I mean, there's so much to sort out, but we're not sticking to the linear story. Obviously, we thought we could go from the 80s to the 90s, and there's a lot to be examined there. But then it kind of becomes a little bit stale, I think. And I think we started talking about the community idea, and then it's like someone says, like, is there enough to do there for 10 episodes? And then we realize that, like, not only is there not enough, but like we have way too much stuff. And any topic we've come up with, whether it's, festivals or specific eras or other things, like there's so much to dig through. So to me, like the seasons that we scope out have to have a through line, as a story, and something that allows us to dig deep and get new information, new stories, talk to new people. So I know where I want it to end for sure, but there's a bunch of stuff in the process for season 3.
Where can people find Undermine? When can they expect to hear the first episode, etc.?
September 8th. It will be episode 1. Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcasts. You can go to osirispod.com. Wherever you listen, check it out. It's going to be fun. I will say that, like, the community, part of the challenge with the community was like, how do you actually structure a season? And I'm not going to share it now, but we have a really cool structure for the season that will be told through the lens of kind of a common Fish experience. So I think it'll bring people on a journey that'll be pretty cool. So that starts September 8th.
Today's chosen jam is 46 Days, segueing into Bug from August 15th, 2015, the summer 2015 tour. And to give some context to the listeners, RJ, I'm just going to read a little bit about the summer of 2015 as it relates to Fish, a little bit about my personal experience, but I want you to join in and cut me off at any point. If you have anything you want to chime in, add on to, the door is wide open for you. So today's show at Merriweather was played toward the very end of a long 2015 summer tour. Fish played 31 shows in all of 2015. If you count January in Miami, it's 33 shows. I personally don't. To me, that's inclusive. 2014, yeah. But out of 31 shows, 26 of them were during the summer. So it was like summer and New Year's. That's about it. Some big debuts during this tour included No Men in No Man's Land, Blaze On, Shade, Mercury, How Many People Are You? Scabbard, which I want to make a comeback. Please come back, Trey. I know you're listening. Bring back Scabbard. Heavy Rotation, which I don't know. Do you know that song?
Yeah. That's a Page song, right?
I don't know. I'm asking you.
I think it is. I think it's a Page song.
Okay.
I think it's from the last album.
And not to mention
his last one before the current one.
And this is a quasi debut. This was also the first time at Walnut Creek that they played Slow Llama, was summer 2015.
Yeah, that's wild, because that's quite a I don't know, I guess I wouldn't call it a controversy, but it's something.
It's like a weird binary choice that I can't make. I saw that meme of like the sweaty superhero with the 2 red buttons in front of him that said Fast Llama, Slow Llama. And I don't know which one I would take because every time I hear either one, that's the best one.
Yeah, it's great. They're both great. It's all great. That's the main lesson of Phish. It's all great.
It's all great. I agree. So we would be remiss not to acknowledge that Fare Thee Well was also in the summer of 2015, not Phish. Like, it's not a part of Phish tour, but in my opinion, they're kind of inseparable because of Trey's preparation and performance of all 5 Fare Thee Well shows. I think there's a pretty easy line to draw from Trey's prep for Fare Thee Well straight to the band's excellent playing during this summer tour. Were you at any of the Fare Thee Well shows?
I wasn't, but I do think there's some analog between this tour and the current tour 2021, mostly because of the practice. Like in, Alive Again, the show we just did with Trey, he talked a lot about how much he had been playing during the pandemic. And I think he said that he's been playing more than he has in a really long time. So I feel like there's something there that's really kind of points to the fact that, they're really well rehearsed. They've been playing a lot. They're ready to rock. So there's some analog there.
That idea between 2015 and 2021 was mentioned on your most recent Helping Friendly Pod episode, that 2021 is analogous to 2015 in that they have a lot of different directions they can go into. They came prepared and ready to go. They're very experimental, some new material that kind of rips all those different avenues wide open. And I've been saying that too, that this has been the best tour since 2015. I'm in love with this summer already with 2021, even with fingers crossed Tahoe to come. I say that now with the weather warnings. But also the Gorge and Dix. I mean, there's still a lot of music to come.
Yeah, and it's exciting. I mean, we'll see where the music goes, but they're definitely having fun and really pretty connected, and I think there's a lot of great communication happening, which is almost more important than how they're individually playing, but they're all playing well too.
Agreed. So I was at the 3 Chicago Fare Thee Well shows. I remember I was very impressed there with how great Trey sounded. But for this discussion for Phish 2015, I remember very distinctly sitting at my desk listening to audience recordings of the first few shows at Bend and hearing Blaze On and No Men in No Man's Land. And I thought, this is great new music. This is fun party music, which a lot of Joy and Fuego or Wingsuit, whatever, it was that was very introspective, whereas I felt like Blaze On and No Men in No Man's Land, which were kind of the tent pulse jam songs of that summer, they were just there for a good time. It was just good music. So tight, prepared, and rehearsed Trey, plus almost an album's worth of new material, led to what I consider one of the best tours of 3.0. And people who have listened to this podcast know that in the summer of 2015, I was coping with a recent divorce, and I spoiled myself in 2015 by going to Chicago. I went by myself to see Phish in Nashville, both shows at the Men, Merriweather Post, and Magnaball. And this was the first of 2 nights at Merriweather, and it was the last tour stop before Magnaball a few days later. So where were you in the summer of 2015 that led you to Merriweather?
So I was living in DC, and I guess, at that point, I've been doing the Helping Friendly podcast for 2 years or so. And I would say that this tour was the most I'd been back into the band since, the late 90s. And I was understanding and kind of appreciating the music in new ways. That was probably the first time that I thought, like, this band is so much better now than they've ever been, just from a musical perspective. And this particular tour, because of the reasons you mentioned, I think they were even better. But so I was kind of back into it, and going to Magnaball and went to Merriweather before Magnaball. These were really, being in DC, we would always stay at the Sheraton at Merriweather and just hang out for the weekend, and have someone stay with our then 2-year-old at the time. So it was just a fun weekend, and that's what Merriweather always was for me.
And have you been seeing them consistently since 2015? Like, did that flip a switch for you?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think the podcast had a lot to do with it in that it was a way for me to justify going to more shows,
Yeah, well, the fans will tear you apart if you don't sound
Yeah.
like you know what you're talking about.
There's that, and then there's the, back to the community. I mean, I've met, I don't know, dozens, if not hundreds of people, through the podcast who I met on Twitter mostly, who came on the show or I met, posting about the show or listened, who I now see at shows and go to shows with. So that definitely, there was a new kind of bigger community to be a part of, which is really awesome.
I feel similar, doing this. I've met so many people just in the same manner that you described. And I agree. It's become this weird uncanny valley between in-person and digital community where you feel these people that you've never met in person before. And then when you do, you have these conversations as if you just caught up over a 3-hour dinner the night before. Meanwhile, You've never seen each other face to face. It's a weird world that we live in.
It's crazy. I remember in Merriweather 2014, which was like the first summer tour after we started our podcast. And it was, meeting people for the first time and hanging out with people for the first time who I'd been communicating with on Twitter. It's just, it's weird. It's a weird, really weird community, but I'm really glad to be part of it.
And this sequence of 46 days into Bug, this was played toward the beginning of the second set. I liked this night better than the other Merriweather post, just the set list and the antics with NO2 and everything. And they played Glide, I think, at this show, which is my favorite song. Everything clicked on this night. It was my first time ever at Merriweather Post. And this 46 Days in Bug is extremely memorable for a memorable show. Why did you pick this jam of all the shows that you've seen? Why do you have attendance bias toward this?
It has a little bit of everything that I love. It has a really great kind of diversity of improv. There's a little darkness. There's the kind of blissful major key jams. And then there's this, what reminded me of it again was the 2021 summer tour tendency to kind of drop into a perfect song after a long jam. They've done it a couple times this tour. And this was just like one of those things. I mean, you could argue that you could sort of hear it in the 46 Days jam a little bit, but I think the drop into Bug was just perfect. And to me, I think that's one of the greatest moments at a Phish show, because it's like it's a cool down moment, but it's also just, with a song like this, it just works perfectly.
So at the beginning, it sounds like a usual 46 days. What appealed to me is that Fishman barely uses any cymbals for the first 2 minutes. I know that he normally focuses on the wood blocks at the beginning of 46 days, but when I listened back to this is like Velvet Underground first album level of cymbal avoidance. Like he barely touches them until the first chorus. And even then it's just for emphasis. He doesn't hold on to his hi-hat at all. Right. This is a very powerful opening.
Yeah. I mean, it's really, really high energy. And I feel like you never know what they're thinking, obviously, when they go into a song or choose a song, but coming out with the Haleys into 46 Days, I feel like this was the time in the set when it was like, let's see what we can do here. And it starts from the beginning. I mean, I do think the beginning part is a little bit different, and kind of sets up this jamming that comes next. How
is it different? Because I heard the same 46 Days I always hear.
I think that, well, I guess in the first like couple minutes, it's probably pretty similar, but I think, right. Once you get to 3 or 4 minutes and it feels like they're already kind of, I mean, Trey particularly is already using effects that wouldn't come within the chorus or verses of a song like this. And, by 5 minutes in the song, they're in a totally different song.
around 4 minutes or so. I don't have a guitarist's vocabulary. I don't know anything about pedals. I know wah-wah pedal. And then I'm out. I'm out.
Yeah.
But I did notice he turns to really good finger tapping around 4 minutes and 45 seconds. And it's like Iron Maiden type heavy metal guitarists. And we're in a psychedelic arena rock god world. And that's when you say that you heard it's different from usual 46 days. My impression is usually like Pete Townsend power chord, Madison Square Garden, 46 days. This is a bit more rock, psychedelic, heavy metal, 46 days.
Yeah. And using those effects like around, 4 or 5 minutes in, like the tapping you were talking about, I mean, it really kind of starts to build tension and builds up to like a sort of mini, rock solo in the early part of the jam. And I don't know, I think that at the time that was like you knew that the jam was about to take off at that point, given that we're only a few minutes in. And there definitely were just like, it was a departure from the typical just blues rock of 46 days.
Yeah. And they get right back to the blues rock part of it at around 6 minutes. They come back to the chorus, just the 46 days and the coal ran out. And it seems like, okay, now it's going to cool down a little bit. Page is on the organ. It sounds like that's kind of grounding everything, but even Page can't help it. He's probably the most even keel of all of the four musicians, but he starts thundering this boogie woogie piano somewhere around 6.5 or 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And you know that if Page can't hold it together, it's busting wide open.
Yeah. And then Trey comes in and with like some big sort of chords in there that just kind of refocus his attention from like the effects to, there's like a little break there when Page is on the piano and Trey plays a couple of those rock chords. And then, and then they both get into a totally different space and it starts to get really pretty dark and pretty awesome. Yeah, that totally different space is what caught my attention. I've been listening to this sequence almost on repeat since you brought it up. And right around 9 minutes, I think it is, it's like a hard left turn. Now we're in a different world. It's like, where's 46 days?
at this point.
Yeah. I mean, it's there's some disagreement about, sort of the length of jams and whether that is evident of anything. This would be like a good piece of evidence for an argument about why it's actually better that they, within 8 minutes or so, they're in a completely different space. Whereas other times, it takes 15 or 20 minutes to get to a space like this, which is also really fun. But, this is, to me, that's when they're the most well-practiced and paying attention and listening, is when they can like get to these spaces that are so different from the song structure within, 8 or 9 minutes. Like that doesn't, to me, it doesn't seem easy to do. And, they seem to do it pretty seamlessly,
That was a big discussion point in 2019 in the summer when the phrase micro jam started coming around, and they finished the song. They're kind of searching for, like you said, just like maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And all of a sudden you're at this top of a volcano peak, and then it dives out, it goes back down again. Whereas in 2003, for example, speaking of 46 days, it went for something like 35 minutes. Yeah.
And I have to credit my friend Jonathan with bringing micro jams to the surface, or at least being one of the first people to talk about them on the internet. I mean, it's a very real thing, and we've actually seen it a lot in this current tour also. You've seen these like 10, 11 minutes jams that are as powerful as a much longer jam,
while still seeing 20 plus minute jams that kind of mirror this 46 days. They kind of give you a tour of the multiverse, and while still keeping your attention every step of the way, which happens in this 46 days around 12 minutes, which turns into this, I remember at the time, this bliss jamming, it was called.
Yeah.
And that was my favorite part of 2015, when it was uplifting major chords, where I was the stereotypical Phish fan, eyes closed, hands out to the sky in like a Jesus pose, head looking up.
Yeah.
And I just wanted it to wash over me more and more. I even wrote in the notes around 13 minutes, I have a bad habit of saying that, quote, "This is my favorite type of Phish" several times in the same jam. Every time they change, "This is my favorite kind of Phish." And I'm fighting the urge to say it during this jam, considering I love the dark jam that was only 4 minutes prior. Like, we are pretty far from 46 days.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I think it's the best, it's the best kind of Phish jam, particularly live. There's something to be said for letting that kind of wash over you, like you said. I don't know. I think now 2015 is when that happened. Maybe not every show, but almost every show. There were several shows of that tour where that was the kind of primary way that they were improvising, and it does seem like it became a little bit of a crutch or something, or it was just like the easier way to go. Not that it's easy to get there, but you could come to expect it from a long jam. But that doesn't change anything for me. I think it's just when you're there and they're, who doesn't like celebratory peaks? That's like
who doesn't like feeling good?
I mean, there are people who love, the dissonant stuff, like the Split Open and Melt from Nashville a few weeks ago, where like people stop moving because there's no way to really move to the jam. It's just sort of like everyone's staring at the ceiling.
It's how I felt during the Split Open and Melt in Atlantic City, especially toward the end.
Yeah.
They are at the edge, and then like a minute later, they had pushed me over the edge, where I'm just kind of staring up at the sky. Like, I don't know what to do with this music except just kind of let it happen.
Right. Right. And I think, the like complaining about a blissful celebratory jam is just, it's not going to happen for me because it's one of the reasons I like to go. I have this like theory that is probably pretty common, that it's kind of the hose analogy. Like there are parts of the show where the band is clearly leading the energy, and sending it out into the crowd. And then there are times when I think like the crowd is kind of pushing the band in a way. And I think it's a give and take. And in moments like these, especially with Kuroda, the way he's able to anticipate and capitalize on it, it's like, I think those are the best moments live. So I also think you can kind of hear Bug in this jam. Like if you took a portion of this jam out and put it into like the Bug solo, it would sound pretty similar. So I don't know if they were anticipating that or if that was like a coincidence, but it feels like that you can hear that when you listen back to it.
I wanted to ask you that because this jam is about, or this whole track of 46 Days is a little bit more than 16 minutes. It dies down to about half speed. And then it's this perfect piece of music that slowly bleeds into Bug. They don't stop. It's not just a direct, a car crash into Bug. It doesn't save it. It just happens naturally. Yeah. And to me, it sounded like a typical Bug I mean that in a very good way. Bug has, I think, some of Tom's best lyrics. It's a great landing spot for a lot of big jams, which is how I tend to see it. What about this Bug stood out to you? Was it just the placement of it, or was there something deeper to it?
Yeah, I mean, I started thinking about it after the Hershey show when they played the Bug right after Birds of a Feather jam, which was also such a great jam. Yeah, I think like the placement of it is just great. I mean, I think there's like a few songs like this that are great to hear in that spot. I mean, Life Boy, Bug. I actually think that, I really love more. I think there are songs that I think just when they play a little bit of a breather after a long jam, it's just perfect. But this is, the hearing this song live versus on tape or, after the fact is totally different. Like the lights are great. There's
it's the name of the show you're on right now, man. We are on attendance bias. It is real.
Exactly. The solo is great, but there's also just, the interaction with the crowd, people having their cathartic moment with It Doesn't Matter. I mean, it's just always like a great moment at a show. And I think coming after a long kind of intense jam is the perfect placement for it. So I remember at the time just hearing them start Bug, and I was like, it's just perfect. So in terms of the version of the song, I'm not sure that this particular version is better or different than any other one, but just the placement and the way that it worked together with the 46 Days, I think was just amazing. And I don't love 46 Days. It's not one of my favorite songs. So being there at that moment and hearing them take it into a totally different place and then drop into Bug, I just thought it was such a memorable piece of music.
RJB of Osiris Media, thanks so much for coming on Attendance Bias to discuss everything, to talk about podcasting, to talk about Osiris Media, getting us excited for season 2 of Undermine, to talk about this version of 46 Days into Bug and 2015, the summer of 2015 in general. We snuck a lot in there in the time that we had. So I want to say thank you for being gracious with your time. I know that you're busy. I want to say good luck to you for season 2 of Undermine and all of the future projects with Osiris. Thanks so much for being here and bringing this jam to the attention of so many.
No, thank you so much. Thanks for saying that. I know how hard it is to build a podcast and to build an audience and to keep it going and to do everything, you're doing. So nice work and keep it up. And thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
And before we end this, just one more time about when Undermine season 2 is airing, where people can find it.
Yeah, Undermine season 2 will be premiering September 8th, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a review, share it, tell us what you think, interact with us on social media, and we appreciate everyone listening and following along.
All right, thanks again, RJ.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. It was really nice to talk to you, man.
At this point, we normally do an attendance bias fact check. But since today's interview was mostly focused on Osiris Media, on RJ, and about Undermine, there really weren't too many miscommunications or facts thrown out there. The only one I really needed to focus on and double check was our brief discussion about the Paige McConnell song Heavy Rotation. RJ was correct that Heavy Rotation is off Paige's self-titled album, and it's actually only been played once by Phish, on July 22nd, 2015 at the Les Schwab Amphitheater in Bend, Oregon. Other than that, I think we were pretty tight on our facts and figures this episode. So that's it for today's episode of Attendance Bias with RJB. I'd like to thank RJ for joining me today, Phish.net for everything they do, and Phish.in for the recording used in today's episode. Of course, I have to thank Osiris Media for their hard work and leading the way in the world of professional Phish podcasting. If you enjoy Attendance Bias, please support the show by leaving a rating and a review of the show on your favorite podcast app. You could also tell one person about the show, spread the word, and have them give it a listen. Come and find Attendance Bias on social media, particularly on Twitter and on Instagram. Reach out to me and I'll send you a free sticker. Thank you so much again for listening, and I'll see you next week on Attendance Bias.